I would like to introduce you today to Sharon Wilson Géno. And Sharon is the Executive Vice President of National Services, and she's also Chief Operating Officer at Volunteers of America, one of the nation's largest nonprofit affordable housing developers. In this role, Sharon leads the operations of the National Services work with the National Services Board of Directors and helps position the organization as it looks for new healthcare and housing opportunities. Prior to this role, Sharon was a senior vice president of legal affairs, where she provided advice and counsel to the organization on a wide variety of legal matters, including housing operations and housing development issues. For nearly 25 years, Sharon has been dedicated to advising nonprofit, for-profit, and governmental clients across the country on affordable housing and community development issues in a variety of contexts. Prior to joining Volunteers of America, Sharon was a partner in private practice in Washington, D.C., where she advised governmental entities, for-profit and nonprofit organizations across the country on issues related to housing and community development projects, government contracting, corporate structure, internal governance, and compliance with federal, state, and local laws. During her career, Sharon has served as both in-house counsel and outside general counsel for various types of organizations. Her legal experience includes providing advice regarding government and non-government contracts, nonprofit organizations, corporate formation, litigation, employment law, tax law, and other topics. That's a lot. She has also worked on legislation and advocacy efforts related to affordable housing programs on both the local and national levels. So welcome, Sharon Wilson Géno.
Well, thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Now, Sharon, you're a fellow in the Academy of Housing and Communities, which means that you were selected as one of the men and women who have forged public policy and the direction of housing and communities. So tell us a little more about what role you played and how you feel you made some changes or made some advances in this area.
I feel like I've been so fortunate to be able to work in this space for such a long time. Much of my career prior to coming to Volunteers of America was really in the public housing world. And a lot of that working on behalf of some of the nation's largest public housing authorities on the advocacy side, as well as advocating for funding and different kinds of changes to make the program work better. I came to Washington, although I've been working in community development in St. Louis, my hometown, since the early 90s. I came to Washington in 1997. And what better time to start working in public housing right before the public housing reform bill passed in 1998. And I gotta say, I was in the room where it happened, which was a very tiny conference room off the Capitol, where they typically don't hold the appropriations hearings. But I think there was so much interest in what the new public housing program was going to be, and that bill had been 4 years in the making, that I squeezed in like a sardine with a number of other people. And really, perfect timing for me. There were so many new reforms and opportunities. While mixed finance had been going on for some period of time, sort of nanoscent with the tax credit, the opportunities in that new bill really opened up new avenues for public housing to become much more akin to the private sector quality, to have mixes of incomes, to bring services in, and to really be flexible and move us away from some of the systems that we knew had failed in the past. So that was a very exciting opportunity for me. And much of my career after that was just leveraging the knowledge and the experience that I gained in working on that bill. And helping to implement pieces of that bill. There are multiple regulations that came out over the following several years, and really having a hand in working on those. The other thing that actually predated the public housing reform bill, which many people don't realize, was the Moving to Work program. And that had passed in 1996, but very little had happened with it until after the public housing reform bill had passed. So once the public housing reform bill really gave people the opening to try some new things in public housing, moving to work was really able to take off as a small demonstration, which grew and a lot of lessons learned in that program, which I was able to be involved in, are things that housing authorities are using across the country today.
Yes, moving to work has, I think, really become big on the table because so many people are trying to get more flexibility at the local level, make programs better, make them tailored more to the people that they're serving at the local level. And talk a little bit about that, because a lot of people may not understand what moving to work really is.
I start most conversations about moving to work, and that moving to work has little to do with either moving or work. Ironically, it was a good and a bad moniker that got slapped on a program that the whole concept was to make better use of federal resources in accordance with local needs. That was really the concept behind it. Moving to work moniker happened because this was all happening at the same time. We were moving the welfare system to more of a work-related system, and that was a very popular concept at the time. So it had both Democratic and Republican support, but frankly, more Republican support. The Republicans had control of the Congress at the time. So it was a way to really tie that concept that was very popular in moving welfare work to the innovation in the public housing program. The exciting things that I like almost everything about moving to work, it's been used in a multitude of different ways for very high performing agencies to really go out and be real players in their communities and make so much better use and be entrepreneurial and make those federal dollars grow, because we all know that those monies are not going to be appropriated in the levels they have been in the past from Congress. And then secondly, it has been overlooked perhaps as much. It has been an enormous tool to really move housing authorities that were struggling out from where they were into the future at a much more rapid rate. I had the privilege of working on the Chicago Housing Authority Plan for Transformation for many years and really moving that ball forward. And boy, without moving to work, there was no way that the Chicago Housing Authority was ever going to be able to dig out of the sad situation that they had been in. And they really were able to accelerate within a 10-year period, remarkable change. I also had the opportunity to work with the Philadelphia Housing Authority, which had struggled for many years, but used the moving to work flexibility very carefully and moved $1.2 billion worth of housing development in 10 years. That not only changed the lives of those people in the housing that was there, it changed the entire city. And I would argue that the CHA Moving to Work program and others really changed the landscape of the entire city. So it's been a really exciting opportunity.
Now, the two things that I think of when I think of moving to work are the fungibility of the dollars between the programs, and then generally the regulations that no longer would apply, the specific ones in the program. Are there any other differences that you think are very obvious?
The fungibility was huge. And that was really the thing that made it go in Chicago and Philadelphia and other places. But there was a lot of little techie stuff that people didn't realize that allowed housing authorities to be better players, which was speed of business things, some streamlining of the procurement processes, which had often made housing authorities not able to keep up with private sector investors. A little piece that we worked on in a number of places that I think is great is the opportunity to master lease units to service providers. So you can really marry, whether it's service providers that work in the domestic violence space, in the senior space, in other specialized populations, you can marry that subsidy with that service piece and make it much more robust. So those are just two examples, but there are a multitude of ways where, and it really got communities thinking too about, gee, if I had the money to do this is what I need to do. If I could take this money and make it do this, I would really have something. And it really pushed communities to be creative about solving their own problems and not really waiting for the federal government to pass a regulation or pass a program. It made communities become much more active and residents become more active in what happened, because that moving to work plan had to get passed every year. So every year there was thought put behind how do we use our resources in the best way possible.
So Congress now limits the number of MTW agencies. What do you think is the future for that?
You know, it's a sad fact. I think they're really were very short-sighted about that. And I think that unfortunately, it's gotten a name that still the moving to work name puts it in a place that people aren't comfortable with it. And there's still some distrust of giving that flexibility long and wide to housing authorities. But I think they've all proven over time that those that have used it have been successful at using it.
Well, you know, if they could put some kind of, I don't know, auditing control mechanism, you know, I think it's hard to do because when they all do their own special programs, in a sense, or their version of it, then I think that's what makes HUD and maybe HUD and certainly Congress nervous about how are we going to control this. But do you think that level of control is needed?
I think now, I mean, there might have been a time, again, the public housing program in terms of sophistication and really the oversight by the private sector, because so many of them have low-income housing tax credits and other investment in those properties, that oversight's already there. I don't think housing authorities can really go rogue anymore just because they have so many eyes on what they're doing. And so I understand the concern perhaps 20 years ago. But today, I think they should be treated like other businesses. Have a set of outcomes you need to achieve, have some guardrails around things you absolutely can't do, and then let them go. The real intent of the program was each program was supposed to be evaluated individually. There wasn't supposed to be this group evaluation. And instead, unfortunately, governments do what governments do. They try to put everybody in a box. And the whole point of the program was not to put anyone in a box. So that's been quite a struggle in getting the message out.
Do you think there should be any limitations on size of the agency? And I guess I'm thinking the smallness of an agency. Are there some that maybe you're only talking about X number of units or X dollars and up, or any thoughts on that?
And you know, that's interesting because at the same time, the department has over time moved a policy, and they even moved it in the public housing reform bill to create consolidation among smaller agencies. And moving to work actually allows for a lot of that consolidation with some flexibility in housing authorities working together without going through the legal and more difficult morass of going together. So I think it can really be a tool in creating economies of scale. You know, for example, the Louisville Metro Housing Authority at the time, as one of the original moving to work agencies, then combined with Clark County. And it was part of an overall government consolidation program, but that enabled a smaller agency to take advantage of a lot of those benefits that the larger agency had, and then put forth a regional housing strategy, which is a lot of what HUD has been a proponent of for many years.
So Sharon, when did you originally come into the housing field? What year?
I left my brand spanking new law firm job in 1993 after a little over a year, where I realized it was just not, after years of study, blood, sweat, and tears, realized it was not what I wanted to do, and just made a complete career shift. Went back to school and got a graduate degree in urban policy, and went to work for a very small consulting firm in St. Louis, where I'm from, for a gentleman, and it was really only 4 of us, but he had run the Model Cities program back in the 60s in St. Louis, and he was kind of the guy who any housing community development work that was done in the city, he was the guy people called on to make it happen. So I had an enormously wonderful teacher who I had direct access to, who gave me a lot of responsibility at a very young age, and just made sure that I had to learn it. I had no choice. Thrown in the deep end of the pool and learned to swim.
What about the changes in policy, public policy over those years? Do you think there's any lessons maybe that we could or should have learned?
Gosh, a lot. I think the advent of the money from private sectors has really changed the policy game. When public housing agencies were 100% publicly funded, and that was the resource, there was a lot more politics, I think, in the mix. Not that there still isn't politics in the mix, but now again that you have bankers and investors who are looking over the shoulders of these agencies to be sure they're fiscally responsible, responsible from a compliance side, etc. I think that the policy has changed to allow for that, because we all know that the federal government is no longer going to be the primary funder of these programs moving forward.
So that kind of takes us into RAD.
Yes.
And tell us how you feel about that program, and the viability of it, the longevity of it, and whether people generally want to go the project-based voucher route or the PBRA route. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have very mixed feelings about the RAD program, and had really, and the exception of it was in the Public Housing Reform Bill in 1998. So the bill authorized the Harvard cost study, and the Harvard cost study was supposed to, the whole purpose of it was only to get some outside eyes on what the operating subsidy really should be. That was really all it was intended to do. It was just have some outside eyes saying, okay, you know, the contract, the ACC contract says there's the gap between need and cost, and we're going to make that difference. So all it was intended to do was figure that part out. But what it did do was go well beyond that and really start creating the groundwork for what is now the RAD program today. And initially, it was conceived of the fact that only so many of these units were going to make it under RAD, and that the federal government had to continue to fund a pretty sizable, I think the number was like $400 million capital chunk over 10 years to help supplement the properties that didn't have enough operating subsidy to cover the costs of leveraging the debt needed to bring them up to appropriate standards. That money was never appropriated. And if that money had been appropriated, there is a little pot now, but if that money had been appropriated, you would see that it would take care of those units theoretically. As it plays out now, it really is a triaging strategy. We're going to lose units. We've already lost them, and we're going to continue to lose them. And the cost of construction is not going down. The cost of land is not going down. So we have made a trade-off in the expectation the private sector can provide them through private landlords or through other kinds of funding mechanisms, and we're not seeing that happening. So that's why you have this crunch now, some 20 years later, because the supply, if you have a supply, and you're protecting that supply, you can guard against the market changes and increases in the market. Because we haven't invested in that supply, we've let those units go. We are in the situation we're in today.
I'd really like to hear more about what you're doing with the Volunteers of America. Now, let's kind of set the stage for the kind of units you have, the kind of subsidy you're doing, what new things you're able to do. Talk about all that stuff with me, will you?
Oh, this is the funnest job ever. It's enormously challenging every single day, but it truly is a great job, and it's everything I wanted and more in making the shift from coming to a private law firm practice to a nonprofit setting. I was really sort of in a mid-career situation, thinking about what were the things I really liked in my legal practice, what were the things I enjoyed the most, and how could I get more of that? And it really was the opportunities I had to work in agencies like the Chicago Housing Authority, like the Philadelphia Housing Authority, and other DC Housing Authority, where I was in with them. I was part of the mission. I was part of the furniture. I wasn't their employee, but I was working alongside the policymakers and the thinkers and the development team. And I really liked that part of moving an agency forward. So VOA provided the opportunity to do that. And the thing that intrigued me the most was the fact that we are one of the few national organizations that does both affordable housing and healthcare. So what my affordable housing friends don't see is we run a whole other business on the other side of the house, which is senior long-term care. We run 8 different businesses in 9 different states. And when I was working in the public housing space, I had the opportunity with some very creative clients to work on bringing healthcare services, particularly with seniors, into public housing. And I could see that that was an exciting opportunity that would save the government money and time and create better outcomes. But not everybody was doing it. It's complicated. So the opportunity to come to VOA really allows me to do both. In terms of our housing portfolio, we're one of the largest nonprofit developers in the country. We have going on 21,000 units in now 40 states in Puerto Rico. We have everything under the sun, down to 4 unit 811s to 320 unit family buildings, and everything in between. A good chunk of our history and our legacy portfolio is in the HUD 202 program. We were early adapters as a nonprofit in 202. So probably about 70%, give or take, of our property is senior, of all different varieties. And some of it is also supported 811 IDD populations. We're doing housing specifically for people, veterans, and then we run family properties as well. It really gives us a chance to bring that healthcare experience into the housing model and try to marry those two things. What I'm doing right now that I'm most excited about is really in that senior space with the growing aging population, allowing us to bring our healthcare services in side by side with our housing services, create those better outcomes and save money.
I love what you're saying because it makes so much sense. You know, we just can't separate things all the time. You know, we tend to separate the families from the services that they need, like work and transportation and medical and all those things. And then we tend to also, in the past, have separated in little silos the things that older people need. And you've brought those two together, which is just so important. And with all the population growing older, as we are exhibiting, why isn't there more of that? Why aren't people doing more? Is it just that we're so used to the silos, or what do you think?
There's a whole variety of reasons. And the biggest one is, it's most fundamental, housing is a place-based strategy for supporting people. You go to a place. Healthcare is a person-based. You can take your subsidy and go anywhere you want. There's a lot of flexibility in many states to change providers over time. You can change once a month if you want. So you have these two diametrically opposed directions in the two systems. A lot of it's jargon and the systems don't talk, but until very recently, the big change here is that when I started working on some of these programs back in 2000, actually, trying to get more money for senior housing for healthcare services, but there was no incentive on the healthcare side. Fee-for-service system. Everybody got paid by the person, not by the unit, not by the cost. So there was no incentive to save money on the healthcare side, and the housers didn't have the money to really move it forward. With the advent of managed care, ACOs, and really the ACA, the entire healthcare world is now moving in this direction of trying to leverage their costs and control costs. And they see, oh, gee, housing now will save us money, and that will put money in our pockets. So now, many of us are being chased by these payers who never had the time of day for us. How can we partner? How can we partner? How can we partner? Because there's financial incentive in their house.
I bet you're happy to see that, aren't you?
It's really fun, but it's really daunting of kind of where is the best place for them to plug and play. And then the other thing I'll put on the table that we're all groping with is the data to support those cost savings that are being generated by putting these two things together. The healthcare payers are not going to invest unless they have good data to show that they're going to save from expending on the healthcare side by using a housing model or having the opportunity to bring services into a senior housing building, for example. So it's really making that connection for them, collecting the right data and doing it in an appropriate way so we can prove that model out.
Thinking back over the years, what would you say is your biggest success story?
Wow. I mean, they're big and they're small. I had the opportunity, and one of the things I'm most proud of is I had the opportunity to work on what ended up being the largest Hope 6 development in the country, which is here in DC, the Capper Carrollsburg Hope 6, which is now all the housing and economic development around the baseball stadium. I worked on that project for 13 years, and it's still going, 2 more buildings left. And I know that because I live 4 blocks away. And to be able to work on that project over time, watching my children grow up playing now in that neighborhood that was never accessible to any of us before, and knowing kids that live there, and being able to take advantage of the restaurants and see the families working together, and those people are now my neighbors. And that's a really exciting thing for me.
That's really great. Can you think of a challenge that you've overcome in your past that you'd like to share with us?
Oh my. I think just continuing to get up every day and know that change is incremental, and I'm not always the most patient person. So being sure that I, continue to remind myself that staying on track with moving these programs forward is something that takes time. But and I was just in a meeting with my staff, and I said, stop, turn around and look behind you and see what's been created. I mean, I would have never thought that I would have worked on the CAPRA program for 13 years. I would have never thought we'd see those buildings. Working on the Chicago Plan for Transformation, I would have thought we never would have gotten that agreement signed. We got it signed on the last day of the Clinton administration, chasing Assistant Secretary Lucas, and we signed it on his back. Actually, we had somebody bent over, turned around, and signed it. And put the folks in Chicago back on a plane so they could deliver it to Mayor Daley. So just knowing that if you keep working it, it changes. And when I first started working on this in 1997, we would go to congressional offices and nobody wanted to hear about public housing or affordable housing. And now it's all anyone can talk about. So to me, that's a huge shift and a huge accomplishment.
Well, and we're hearing about affordable housing in a different way. I mean, it used to be when we said subsidized housing, that was the term we used, and we meant the public housing and vouchers and the private sector subsidized housing. Now we talk about workforce housing, we talk about affordable housing, and we are talking about a bigger segment of the population. Talk a little bit about that and some of the challenges that we have with supply and demand.
It now hits everyone. It used to be those people over there, and we had a view of who those people were, and they weren't us. They weren't our neighbors. They weren't our friends. And there was still this sort of lingering view that somehow they did something to deserve to be relegated to public housing. Now, with wages not keeping pace with the cost of housing in many, many communities, those are our neighbors, those are our firefighters, those are our teachers. We at Volunteers of America National Services are working on a couple workforce projects that we're targeting to our own healthcare workers. Because the subsidy that we get, those are now low-wage workers. The subsidy we get from the Medicare and Medicaid programs isn't sufficient to bring them up past, we get them a living wage, but not much past that. So we're now working on creating workforce housing to support our own workforce, to support the care of the seniors that we serve.
So do you have a good definition of workforce housing, or where that originated, or how long that's been around?
I think that was, to your point, it was sort of antithetical to the subsidized, the idea of subsidized sounded bad. So, okay, What should we do? This is work. These are people that are working, and even subsidized housing, who lives in subsidized housing? They're people that work too. So, but trying to create this distinction, and people typically, I mean, it depends on where you are. People look at that from 80% AMI to 120, or in some communities to 150. I think it just depends on where you are. But again, if you go, in some communities you dip below even 60, those are people that need workforce housing and may or may not qualify. You've got that gap between that 60 and 80, the tax credit cuts off, but you have the opportunity for HUD subsidy. That's a workforce piece too. They get some service, but probably not sufficient.
I'm hearing that the Gen Zers and the younger millennials are having such trouble in so many cities. I mean, California is certainly one that they talk about, but that they're having to just double up and triple up, and that's the only way that they can afford any place. Do you think we'll start to get a real change in public attitude and public policy when this starts to happen?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think the Bernie Sanders campaign is a direct reaction to that. And really the increase in the cost of education. I've taught for many years at both Georgetown Law School and at GW, And I ask my students every year, how many of you think you'll own a home? When I first started doing this in 2006, everybody raised their hand. 2009, for about 6 or 7 years, nobody raised their hand. And these kids are exhausted by student loan debt. And I find it interesting, that the student loan connection probably has a bigger impact on housing and housing affordability than anything. It's interesting, in FHA, which is a great program, the government provides a loan, taxpayers support it, but we go out and kick the tires. Appraiser comes out, he's got requirements, he goes out and sees if the value of that home is sufficient to support the loan that we're going to provide. We provide student loans, but we never go out and kick the tires. Those loan amounts are allowed to increase to whatever the schools decide to set the price to. And so we've had this ridiculous increase in student loan debt because of that, uncontrolled. Same principle though, you've got government supported debt for good reason, one controlled and works pretty well and always has, one not controlled that's really impacting the other.
Other than changing legislation so that somehow it's subsidized, what are some of the things we could do?
I think really, and again, the Obama administration started to play around with this, but the political backlash on limiting the amount of increases that tuition can be raised over a period of time, or having to prove out before you can use the student loan program to support it. I think you got to do it in parallel with how you do FHA. You can only get a loan up to so much amount because someone has decided what the value of that home is. We say, oh, we can't value an education. We value everything. You can value an education if you wanted to. You could come up with some formula. But until we get our arms around that, young professionals are going to be postponing home ownership, postponing that wealth increase that home ownership can provide because they are saddled with student loan debt.
And I'm also hearing that younger people are not looking for the same thing that their parents were. They don't necessarily want the great big house with the great big yard. What are you hearing about that?
Many of them are location, and then this opportunity to change location. When you own the big house with the big yard, you're kind of there to maintain. With the workforce being so mobile now, and you can work from anywhere, people don't see that as valued. But what I think a lot of the data is showing, though, is it's maybe valued later in life. So you've got a chunk of workforce over time so you've got a bigger chunk in this sort of this space right now. But when you get to the late 30, over 40 crowd, they're kind of going in that same direction. It's just taking a whole lot longer because they're paying off student loan debt. They're traveling more. They're having more experiences before they get to that stage of their life.
What advice would you give to younger people today that are kind of just starting out, trying to make it with all the things we've been talking about?
Well, when I made that decision to ditch my law career at the tender age of 25, with a mountain of student loan debt, I might add, and cut my salary 75% and go back to school and take on some more debt, which my parents were not too pleased about. Someone gave me this book, and it sticks with me. It's a very small book, and it says, "Do what you love and the money will follow." And I remind myself of that from time to time. And I think what that means for people is, you've got to be passionate about what you do, and then how much money you need sort of gets sized in your level of passion for the work that you pursue. And again, I've been so fortunate. There is not a day that I don't love something I'm doing, and I don't want to get out of bed or I want to do anything else. This is the space for me, and it's work for me.
Isn't that great?
How did we get so lucky?
How did we get so lucky? Because, loving what you do, and because you got to put all that time in anyway, it's something. So loving what you do is the icing on the cake.
Yeah, and there are tough days, and today was one of them. As a matter of fact.
There are tough days.
And there are some really hard days, and you got to do some really hard things. But eye on the prize, being fortunate enough to be able to pursue a career in something I enjoy and get great satisfaction of is the best advice I give anyone.
And sometimes those things that are tough and the tough days are kind of fun too, because they're such a challenge that once you get finished with that day, you're like, I did it.
Exactly. Or I got through it, which is today's going to be one of those, just I got through it.
Yeah, you've been so helpful and given us all your thoughts, and I'm so, I hard to say proud of you, but I am, in running this great big organization, which I think is fabulous. When you have 21,000, is that what you said, units?
21,000.
That's enormous.
It's big.
You're just doing a great job, and I'm really just pleased as I can be that you're doing it so well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Is there anything else you'd like to leave our listeners with?
No, I appreciate this opportunity. I think this project is fantastic for people that are interested in pursuing this career. Again, I was mentored by some amazing people, and learning the stories of people that have worked in this career, I hope inspires others.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.